Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where you'll learn how to establish a security maturity modeling process. And just a reminder, we'll be sending you a link to the webinar recording along with the slide deck. My name's Jeff Gall, Chief Operations Officer at SimpleRisk, and I'll be the moderator. And before getting started, I'd like to introduce the presenters, Josh Sokol, SimpleRisk founder, CEO, CISO, and creator of the SimpleRisk GRC platform, and Michael Rasmussen, GRC Pundit and founder of GRC 2020 Research. Both Michael and Josh have extensive security backgrounds and are widely viewed as GRC subject matter experts and thought leaders. From 2010 to 2020, Josh Sokol ran the Enterprise Risk Management Program at National Instruments, a $1.6 billion publicly traded global company. And when Josh learned he'd been given zero budget to build his program, out of necessity, he created the first version of SimpleRisk because, well, spreadsheets don't scale. In 2013, Josh released the free and open source product, SimpleRisk Core, at a B-Sides security conference, and a funny thing happened. It went viral. People started using it, loved the simplicity, and there were numerous requests to add paid-for functionality. And when the commercial version gained traction, Josh founded SimpleRisk and transitioned to full-time CEO in 2020. Since then, SimpleRisk has experienced enormous growth, and the product has evolved into a fully featured GRC and incident management platform with global adoption. Michael Rasmussen has over 30 years of experience in the GRC space and was given one of the coolest monikers in the industry when he became known as the father of GRC after being the first analyst to define the GRC market model as a VP at Forrester in 2002. He has an international following as a GRC expert and is almost always on a plane traveling to a conference or an industry event where he's the keynote speaker or subject matter expert. He's also an author, and above all, he's a trusted advisor who's helped countless organizations establish their GRC process and strategy. Together, Michael and Josh will walk you through how to perform security maturity modeling in your own organizations. And today you'll learn how to define organizational cybersecurity and build your roadmap, establish a security baseline, and set your desired security maturity goals. And you'll also learn how to go about prioritizing the steps along the way. It's worth mentioning that this exercise will be accomplished using SimpleRisk Core, the free and open source product that has continually been enhanced over the years. And as Josh and Michael go through the presentation, we encourage your input. So please use the Zoom Q&A feature. It's located in the bottom tray of the Zoom app to submit your questions, and they'll be answered at the end. Michael, since you're first up, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. And it's an absolute delight and pleasure to be here today. So let me set the stage for how do we address cybersecurity. But in setting that stage, it's important to understand, what are we up against? The modern organization is what I characterize as navigating chaos. And cybersecurity plays so much into this. Think about it. Laws, regulations, legal exposure, all that, it's changing minute by minute, second by second. Just in financial services, global financial services firms are dealing with 257 regulatory change events every business day coming from 1,217 regulators around the world. A lot of those touch information and privacy in different ways and forms. But we have a changing risk environment, geopolitical risks, economic uncertainty, which could increase fraud, and hacktivism, and all these external threats from the broader world that impact our business, ransomware and all that. But the internal business itself is changing. Employees change. Are they aware of their cybersecurity responsibilities? They move from one role to a different department. We might have inherited rights issues. We have, godlike powers and access to a range of systems so people can conduct and do misdeeds, either inadvertently or maliciously. Technology is changing and evolving, and things aren't patched. And then on top of that, the modern business isn't defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. It's this extended web of vendors and suppliers and other third-party relationships. The modern organization is this, what we call navigating chaos, and trying to bring all of this together and understand that in perspective. And cybersecurity is challenging because we have to keep up with all of this in a business context, in a technical context, and keep up with this constant chaotic change in dynamic nature of business. The physicist Fritjof Capra stated, The more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. Too often, cybersecurity programs are operating in silos that don't see the broader business picture. But cybersecurity has a business impact. And we have to understand how that cybersecurity issue plays into other issues and things and other risks in the environment, and to see this interconnected nature of risk in the business. We need to understand how and be able to, if we're going to increase cybersecurity maturity, we need to be able to communicate to the board and executives, the impact on cybersecurity on achieving objectives in the business. Next slide, please. So, at the end of the day, risk in cybersecurity is our business. Captain James T. Kirk, and I have a blog going out on this just today, a newsletter. But he stated in season 2, episode 20 of the original series, risk is our business. That's what this starship is all about. That's why we're aboard her. And in that context, risk is part of every business. We take risk we take risk. The business that's not taking risk is the business that's out of a business. And so we need to be able to take the right risk and manage that risk well in the organization. It's absolutely critical. So when I started my role, and it was in cybersecurity back in the 90s, I saw risk as something bad. We had to eliminate risk. But no, there's an acceptable level of risk. We can't eliminate risk. There's always going to be risk. Now, is it the right risk? And part of risk management, if we go by ISO 31000's definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. We need good intelligence information. Cybersecurity risk management should mean that we've gone through the scenarios. We understand what's going to happen, so we minimize the surprises in the organization. We have a goal of no surprises, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be uncertainty. And risk management in cybersecurity risk management is about managing uncertainty, but we want to minimize those surprises as well. Next slide, please. So we need to manage the rhythm of cybersecurity, managing security in the cycles and patterns of the business. And as the business changes and evolves, employees move about, they come into the organization, we need to make sure that they clearly understand their cybersecurity responsibilities. As technology gets deployed, we need to make sure that it's properly secured. When it's patched and updated, we need to make sure that it's properly configured and secured as well. When people are given access and third parties are accessed, we need to make sure that that is monitored and that there's proper testing and assessments that are being done to processes, to IT systems, to information. All this is managing cybersecurity in the rhythm of the business and being able to provide contextually relevant information to business executives so that they can properly understand cybersecurity risk exposure and how that can impact them on achieving their objectives. Remember, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. We also need to be resilient. We need to be able to recover from cybersecurity events. Bad things will happen. And as strong as we try to make our cybersecurity fortress, bad things will happen. Resilience is the ability to adapt, to be able to recover from risk events and contain them when they're still small risk events before they become big risk events. We need resilient organizations. And that's part of cybersecurity, is improving that resilience so that we can easily discover cybersecurity issues and recover from them in the business. Next slide, please. But we also need agility, because the business isn't stale. It's changing. It's with navigating chaos. If you're trying to manage your cybersecurity program today to your business that it was 5 years ago, you're out of date. Business has changed, risks has changed, threats have changed, and we need to constantly, continuously monitoring what's new, what's coming at the organization, not just now, but 3 months, 6 months, 12 months from now. What are the scenarios that can play out, and how do I prepare the organization so that we can be agile and avoid risk events, or even leverage risk to our opportunity? Cybersecurity maturity is also about trust and integrity, which has become absolutely critical. Businesses must have mature, established cybersecurity practices to build trust with their customers, with their employees, with their stakeholders, communities, and even their business partners and those third-party relationships. It's absolutely critical. And next slide. So with this, let's turn this over to Josh to get some of his perspectives.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. It is such a pleasure to have you here today. And I absolutely love it every time I get to talk with you about this. Cybersecurity maturity. What is organizational cybersecurity maturity? And just a little bit of background here. When I was running the information security program at National Instruments, I kept hearing this question: When we'll be able to stop spending money on security. And everybody on this call hopefully knows that the spending is never going to stop. The threats, their mitigations are constantly evolving, as Michael said, but I really needed a better response than never. I needed to be able to demonstrate to my management that there was a plan in place that was based on more than just my gut feel. And so I actually started with the Gartner Maturity Assessment, and it gave us a lot of really good high-level advice, but was far from providing us with the answer to this question. We need to create some sort of a roadmap, a long-term strategy, a vision of what to address and when to address it. And we need management support for the activities that will eventually get us there. So let's talk a little bit about controls. Michael mentioned ISO 31000, talks about risk management. We have the ISO 27000 and one standard as well. So what is a security control? These are just the safeguards that we have in place, the countermeasures that help us to avoid, detect, counteract, or minimize these risks to our environment, whether it's property, whether it's systems, or other assets. And these controls are going to protect our CIA, the confidentiality, the integrity, the availability of our data. Now, control maturity is really all about how effective our controls are, how effective the people, the processes, the technology are at mitigating cybersecurity risks. So we talk about immature controls. Immature controls, an example would be an endpoint with only basic password protection. So it doesn't have a lot of stuff going on. There's not a lot of security controls there. And if that password protection fails, so if my password gets leaked on the internet, breached, whatever, that control has failed me. And now that system is at risk of compromise. However, when we start talking about mature controls, we're now talking about an endpoint that has full disk encryption. We're doing complex password requirements. We're talking multi-factor authentication. So if any one of our controls fails, it's not the end of the world. We have multiple other controls, defense in depth, that's going to prevent that system from failing. So let's talk our roadmap. Michael talked about this earlier. How do we actually move from point A to point B? And just like any roadmap, if you're going on a road trip, you have to start with where you are today and you end with where you're going to end up. And everything in between that is your roadmap. How do I get from point A to point B? So how do we assess where we are today? Well, we have to identify that control framework that embodies whatever it is that we're looking to assess. So maybe it's our ISO framework, maybe it's our NIST framework, whatever. It depends on your organization. It depends on the data that you're trying to protect. So if you're trying to protect customer privacy data, or if you're trying to secure credit cards, maybe you're just creating a super duper top secret system. Each system that we're looking to protect is going to have different requirements. And so those requirements are going to dictate how we assess where we're at today. Now, in terms of this exercise that I did when I was at National Instruments, we considered a whole lot of different frameworks. We looked at NIST 853, 171. We looked at the cybersecurity framework. We looked at ISO. We looked at HITRUST. And ultimately, we settled on the NIST cybersecurity framework. Why did we do that? Well, it was free. That was a big one for us. It had a lot of really good best practices in there. And when I looked at it, it was relatively complete. There was a lot of data that was in there. And actually, if you look, I think just yesterday, they released 2.0 version of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So some of this has changed a little bit. They actually added a new function. So we have the 5 NIST CSF functions that were part of the 1. version of NIST CSF. Now it's 6 functions. But essentially what they do is each of these functions get split into multiple different categories. And so this NIST had 23 total categories. And so just looking at identify, to give you guys an example of this, the identify function is then split into further categories, or what they call subcategories. So identify is asset management, business environment, governance, and so on. And then when we look at each of these individual subcategories within there, they all have a set of requirements. So there's 108 of these subcategories or controls in total. And so if you would look here at the asset management one as an example, it talks about the assets in our environment. And we start with IDAM1, which says we have physical devices and systems that are being inventoried. And we go all the way up to IDAM6, which says, hey, we have cybersecurity roles, responsibilities for the entire workforce and third-party stakeholders. Now, each one of these controls is essentially a requirement. It's a thing that they're recommending that we do in our environment in order to protect our security. Now, we'll caveat this whole exercise with CMMC came out after we did this exercise. So there were no NIST CMMC levels of maturity We actually used, I believe it was COBIT or COSO. We used an early maturity model coming from them, and we implemented that across the NIST CSF framework. Now, what's really cool about this is while we're probably more familiar with something like CMMC today, this technique, this method that we use means that you could apply this anywhere. It doesn't matter which framework you're looking at. If you want to create a roadmap for ISO or HITRUST or whatever, there's a very easy way for us to do that. So now when we're talking about assessing our current maturity, or at least how we did it, we basically established these criteria. We define our criteria by reviewing the CSF, our COBIT values, and we eventually landed on these values. Looks very similar to CMMC, slightly different naming, but the idea is the same. You start off with level 0, and then you go all the way up to level 5. 0 being, hey, we don't do this at all, or we don't need to do this. 1 says people are doing this, but it's defined kind of based on tribal knowledge. There's no real documentation or things like that. We move up to level 2, which is the manage process, which says we've identified an owner and we have some documentation out there, but nothing formal, nothing approved by management. Once we move on to established process, we have an owner who's identified and held accountable, and then we have formalized policies and procedures. Then from there, we go up to predictable, which says that not only do we have these processes and procedures in place, but it's audited either by management or by a third party. And then once we get to optimizing, we're talking about automation. We're talking about closed feedback loops, where we're able to look at what we did, how effective it was, and then how do we improve on that process. So we're continually iterating on top of this. And it's really important here to note that most organizations will never have all or even most of their controls at level 4 or 5. I think for most of the organizations out there, having a level 3 is actually a really good target. So keep that in mind as you're going through this exercise. Our goal is not to hit a 5 on everything. Our goal should probably be to hit a 3 on everything. So now when we're talking about asset management, the one that I showed you guys earlier, we have those 6 different subcategories. And our goal here is to assess our current capabilities across each of these subcategories. So I look at IDAM 1 and I said, hey, we're optimizing. We're doing really, really well with this particular process. IDAM 2 is predictable. IDAM 3 is established. So we go through each of those maturity levels for each of our sub-controls. And I talked about all the different controls that are out there. And we say, here's where we're at today. Now, here's where we get to a little bit of advice, because as we're going through this process, we had little, I guess, fires that cropped up, little questions that were asked to us by management. So my first piece of advice to you guys is be honest. Be honest with yourself. So while your understanding of the environment is a gut check at times, you should be able to provide reasonable examples to support your grade or to refute the grade that you gave to others. Now, management is going to come along behind you. They're going to look at all this stuff. They're going to look at the determinations you made. And they're going to question why you said what you did. So as you're going through this, be honest. Stay consistent about how you're scoring these different things. And if you have to choose between 2 different values, err on the side of caution. If you're too optimistic, that can really cause trouble, especially from a compliance perspective. Now, my second piece of advice here is to consider your environment as a whole. So oftentimes we look at the areas that we have the most familiarity with, most expertise in, and we use those to gauge how well we're doing. And usually as security practitioners, the areas that are within our purview are areas that we're actually doing pretty well at. So don't look at your environment as just that individual user or that team. Look at the entire environment and look at how the standard is performed across the organization. If you were to go to 2 different people in your organization, would you get the same result? If the answer is no, take that lowest value. And then number 3 kind of goes along with what I said earlier, which is you have to be prepared to defend your responses. Keep notes. They'll help you with how you judge your future state. They'll keep you consistent throughout the process in terms of how you're thinking, how you're expressing your ideas to other people in your organization. And remember that inaccuracies will lead reviewers and management to question the entire assessment. So it's very important that we're able to document the decisions that we're making and why we're making those decisions. Now, once we have our current maturity and we figured out what we're going to do there, our next step is to assess our desired maturity. Where do we want to get to? And so for this, we need to understand the current risks. Michael talked earlier about the regulatory compliance requirements, and then management's level of risk appetite. So the requirements are going to shape kind of your minimums. Think about that as your floor. What do we have to do to comply with the regulations, the requirements that are out there? But how do we do that in the most efficient means possible? The appetite is going to play a huge role in this, and that's kind of your ceiling, because that's the management calibration. That's what management says, this is the level that we're willing to accept. And Michael talked about this too. He said, hey, it's important to understand that our goal here is not to get rid of all risk in our organization. Our goal here is to basically come up with an acceptable level of risk that we can tolerate. We're talking risk tolerance. So your overall goal here is to set your desired state to the value that gives management comfort over the risk. Without risk, there's not reward. And so we have to be willing to take some risks in our organization. This is especially hard for people who are being routinely audited. And the one piece of advice that I have for you around that is don't let perfection become the enemy of good. We need to make sure that we're going through this process and we're incrementally getting better. We're not searching for that level 5. We're not trying to make it the most perfect system out there. We're trying to get a good system in place. So some advice, be reasonable. Not all risks here require optimized solutions. So when we're talking the desired state, we assess this the same way that we looked at our current state. We use that same scale so that we can compare from one to the next. And just as another reminder, I know I've said this already, but very few organizations are ever going to get to a level 4 or 5. That's really important when we start talking about that kind of target state where we want to be, because if we start telling management we're going to be at a 4, we're going to be at a 5, and you are never able to get there, or the amount of resources that it takes to get you there are just too great for them, they're going to lose their appetite in doing this process very, very quickly. So here's what we did. We basically looked at those same IDAM subcategory controls. We already assessed our current capability, and then we went back on it and we looked at where we want to be. What is our desired state across each of these subcategories or controls? Where we are today, where we want to get to. And then from there, we kind of went through and we said, all right, well, who do these things belong to? Which team owns this particular control? Is there somebody who should be involved in the assessing of where we're at? Is there somebody who should be involved in that future state and what should look like? And especially, one of these things that happens with us as security practitioners is we feel like we're Atlas with the weight of the world on our shoulders. So the goal here is to get a lot of that weight off of our shoulders, to basically move that process to the people in our organization who do have the people resources, the money, the time to be able to impact these changes. Now, security, we're subject matter experts. We're trying to help guide people along the way. We're trying to give them proper solutions. But ultimately, we don't usually have the people or the time, the resources, the money to be able to actually impact the change. We can guide it, but we're not going to be the ones actually implementing it. So when it comes to actually defining our risks, it's pretty simple. Where there's a gap, there's a risk. So if we look at the assessment that I did, I've got my current capability, my desired capability. Where those two are the same, so IDAM 1 through 3, we're good. We're doing what we want to be doing. Now, is there room for more? Absolutely. And so this is not a one and done process. We may want to go through a year from now and go, okay, we're at optimizing, our desired was optimizing, but do we want to improve? Do we want to move that needle further? Now, with respect to IDAM 4, 5, and 6, I have a gap. There's a place here where I said, hey, IDAM 4, we're a managed process, but we want to get to established. For 5, we're performed, we want to get to established. For 6, we're not even doing this, and we want to get to the point where it's predictable. So now we've basically been able to identify that there's a gap between where we are and where we want to be, and we can document that in our risk registry as a risk in our environment. So remember, perform means individuals do it, but it's defined kind of on that tribal knowledge. The established state means that an owner has been identified, held accountable. We've got policies and procedures in place. So our risk here is simple. It's the gap. We don't have defined processes or ownership for the prioritization of resources based on classification, criticality, and business. So we're essentially restating the subcategory, what we're supposed to do there, and we're stating the differences between our performed and our established process. Now, how do we use a GRC tool to capture controls, risks, and more? I'm going to say you can do this with any GRC tool. You could even do this with an Excel spreadsheet. But as Jeff mentioned right up front, SimpleRisk is free. It's open source. You can use what we call our SimpleRisk core to do everything that I talk about today, and it doesn't cost you anything to do that. So let's start with the controls. The idea here is that we're basically going through each of these NIST subcategories, and we're defining these as controls in our environment. Now, again, if we go back to what I said earlier, these controls are the things that are protecting our environment. They're the things that are ensuring that our confidentiality, our integrity, our availability are being kept safe. Now, once we've defined these controls, and this comes from whatever framework you're using, mine are NIST CSF, yours might be ISO, it might be HITRUST. Once we've defined those, the next step is to capture our risks. So again, we talked about how we actually document these risks, where they come from in that gap between our controls. We create a risk in our system that says, this is the problem that we're looking to address. Now, once we create the risks, our next step is to prioritize. And Michael talked about this up front as well. How do we figure out what are the most important risks in our organization? Because we probably don't have time to address them all. We're going to have to figure out where do we start and then where do we end up with. So our risks are going to be based on the degree of the difference between the current and the desired state. They're going to be based on the potential operational and financial impact if this process fails us completely, and then the likelihood of a complete failure of the process. So as we're going through, we can say, here's the current level of impact, and here's the likelihood of this particular event happening. Now, there's lots of other data that we can populate into our risk registry. We can add things like the category. What location is this at? Are there particular assets that are impacted by this? We can define owners and managers and risk sources and all these different things. We can populate all this stuff. And what this does is it gives us reporting capabilities. We can go back and we can say, all right, show me every risk that has to do with a process. Show me every risk that Josh is responsible for. Show me every risk that's stemming from a lack of a policy and procedure. So the ability to basically pivot on these data points and to say, here's the data that's behind them is crucial, because now when management starts asking questions like, how many policies do we need to write? We can point to this and go, here's the number of policies we need to write, and here's the policies that we need to write. Now, hopefully our risk score is going to be automatically calculated based on that. If you did your CISSP, they call this classic risk scoring. It's essentially a likelihood and impact value. Now, we do something a little bit unique in SimpleRisk. Typically, you'll see like a 5x5 matrix, and 5x5 is 25. And so you'll base it on that score. Well, what we actually have is multiple different scoring methodologies. So we'll build in OWASP, we'll build in CVSS, DREAD, all these different scoring methodologies into SimpleRisk. And so this like 0 through 25 thing doesn't make a lot of sense, because you can't take a 10 in CVSS and compare that to a 25 classic likelihood. So we actually put everything on a 0 through 10 scale to make this super easy. You can actually look at it and go, okay, well, that's a 10 in CVSS. It's also a 10 in our classic risk scoring methodology. Now, from here, we have to plan our mitigation. And the mitigation is, how do we address this risk? So in the case of, hey, I'm lacking a policy, our mitigation is to document the desired maturity, to document what we need to do here. So you can see that this is currently being performed by individuals on an ad hoc basis. And then our requirements is that we need to document the process for prioritization of resources based on classification, criticality, and business. So very simple, we've defined what our gap is, what the risk is that results from this gap, how much effort is going to be involved in terms of fixing this risk, and then what needs to actually be done to fix this. So once we have all these different pieces in place, the roadmap just kind of falls before us. So now what we need to do is we need to assess these gaps. Well, assessing gaps is pretty simple. I go through, and for each of the different values that I have, each of my controls, I say, here's where I'm at, here's where I want to be. Cool. Let's plot that on a spider chart so we can see. In this case, I'm doing really well at asset management, but if we look at secure engineering and architecture, it's a big F, right? So now I know these are the things I need to focus on versus here's the things that I'm already doing really well at. Now, the interesting thing here is we talk about optimization and the fact that not everything is going to be a 4 or a 5. When I look at this, there's a couple things that jump out to me. One is the fact that I'm at 0 for secure engineering and architecture. That's a big gap. That's something that I need to fill pretty quickly. The other is that I'm at a 4, but my desired state is a 3 with asset management. So when we're talking about resources and prioritization of my resources, maybe I'm spending too much time, too much money on that asset management functionality. Because my goal was a 3, maybe I can come back a little bit on that and allocate those resources towards secure engineering and architecture instead. Remember, we don't have to be a 4 or a 5. We need to be whatever we set our desired control maturity state is. So now we assess our maturity gaps. We can look at this very easily and we can say, all right, here's the things that are below maturity. Here's the things that are above maturity. Here's the things that are at maturity. So below I need to work on, above it means I'm doing really well. Maybe I can scale back a little bit. And at maturity means I'm good. I'm at the right place. So very easily now we can say, these are the things I need to work on. Now, when it comes to actually building out this roadmap, we can do it in a few different ways. One is we can look at the maturity gaps. But the other thing here we can do is we can look at the burning fires, the high priority items in our environment. What do we do to address these? And these are most likely risks that were scored with a high impact and a high likelihood. These are things that kind of rose to the top of our list, so to speak. This is a prioritization process after all. So the highest priorities are going to be at the top of our list. These are things that are going to cause serious business interruption or financial loss to the company if they happen. So in SimpleRisk, we have what we call the high risk report. And the high risk report is just that. It's going to highlight all the highest level risks in your organization so that you know these are the burning fires. These are the biggest issues in our environment. And then the last one here is going to be, the second to last one is going to be quick wins. So these are our low-hanging fruit. These are the things where the level of effort here is trivial. It's really easy for me to do that thing, but I'm going to get a good amount of risk reduction out of doing that. So these are things that can be accomplished without much assistance from other teams. There's little to no financial or personnel investment in these things. And in SimpleRisk, we have what we call the risk advice report, which can help us to identify these issues. Now, from here, we have the long-term work. Long-term work is more thematic issues. So as an example, we had that company lacks formal documentation. And maybe we see that particular issue across the board. Maybe we don't have formal policies and procedures in place. So maybe we just need to create a project within our organization that's a policy revamp project. So we can go through and we can create this whole project and we can lump all of our risks together and we can make sure that we address these risks all in one big shot, because it's a lot easier to build a whole bunch of policies in one shot, or maybe you're even buying the policies from like a compliance forge or something like that. Well, we get all these policies and now we've solved this particular issue on a broader scale. So these are the long-term things. And then we also have the management goals and objectives. So as an example, when I was at National Instruments, we had a pretty interesting project where they had decided that they wanted to move all of our branch offices. They want to reduce the amount of office space that we had. And so as a result of this particular initiative, I said, all right, well, maybe a remote access policy is something that we could do here. That would be a really quick win for us from a security perspective, but it also supports our leadership initiatives. And management is saying, hey, let's reduce our office space. So cool, we can help do that and make us more secure at the same time. We also had a huge push towards automation to basically build out all sorts of APIs and have scripts that would run and kind of automate stuff in the background. So one of the things that we could do here is we could look at how do we integrate optimized controls? How do we build things like secure development pipelines into our CI/CD and stuff like that? So this helps us to accomplish both the management goal here, the automation thing, while at the same time helping us with security and compliance, making sure we're doing all these things in an automated fashion so nobody even has to think about them later on. Now, in terms of ownership, it's interesting. When I first did this talk, I actually did it with a guy who ran our compliance team at National Instruments. His name was Alex Polomini. And Alex and I had a really interesting relationship because we kind of realized as we're going through here, security, my role was to define the technical controls for the organization and to enforce our controls. And him on the compliance side, his goal here was to define our policies, the guidelines, the standards, the procedures, and then validate that we're in compliance with the requirements that we've defined. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin. We're kind of working together to do this thing. And so we had a really good relationship there. Now, the interesting thing is when we start looking at ownership of the controls and the environment, management fits in here too. Management owns the control environment, they own the remediations. They're the ones who are responsible for defining the course of action and directing any projects. And this is actually really important for us to understand on the security side. I talked about that Atlas syndrome where we feel like we have the weight of the world on our shoulders. Reality is a lot of that goes away once we have that realization that management is the one that's actually directing all this stuff. They're the ones making our decisions. Now, management is going to consult with security and compliance. These are centers of excellence, and they're going to provide that consultation. But hopefully, they're not the ones that are actually implementing the changes. They might help to engineer these changes. They might provide advice and guidance, but they're not usually the ones who are actually making the changes. And then on the far side, we have security and compliance validating. So making sure that we've mitigated these risks and then communicating the status to leadership. So in summary, we essentially have a technique here that we've created. It can be used for assessing maturity of just about anything, as long as you're basing it off of a standard. So again, we use NIST CSF, but if you want to use ISO 27001 or HITRUST or whatever, it doesn't matter. But for our purposes, CSF was great. It did a really good job for assessing our overall information security program. And this whole goal here is about determining where we're at and where we need to get to. So risk management is a very crucial part of this process. It's integral to actually being able to go from the fact that we're doing this today to this is our future state, and how do we actually mitigate these gaps in order to meet our requirements, our future desired state. So with that, I'm going to hand it back off to Michael to kind of lead you towards the end here.
Excellent. So, risk in cybersecurity is a journey, and a good journey. You just don't just run up and tackle everything in one effort. There's stages of maturity, and as Josh said, not everybody needs to be at a level 5. Maybe you got to engage what's achievable for your organization in that cybersecurity maturity. And from getting from a level 1 or 2 to a level 3, for many of you, that's a good goal, at least a short-term goal, maybe even the next 1 to 2 years or even 6 months. But for somebody that's at that level 2 to get to a level 5, that could be a multi-year journey, and maybe needs to be put off a little bit, because the value that you'll achieve just getting to 3 or 4 is going to be of greater benefit to you. But it really starts to understand what your current state is, what's your level of maturity now, and then what's that ideal maturity that you want to achieve. I like to say in 2 years. I think that's a good plan. It could be 1 year. I don't like going over 2 years because the world's so dynamic. That's what I was saying about navigating chaos. It's changing so much. So I think 2-year plans are a good one on this. And so what can you realistically achieve in 2 years? The next thing is, that planning is critical. Again, you have to understand where you're at today, what mountain are you on, and then what mountain are you trying to get to in that level of maturity, and what's your roadmap and path to get there? How are you going to navigate that? It's absolutely critical. Next, what's critical is getting the right team on board. Who should be on this cybersecurity maturity journey team? Obviously, the role of IT security, IT risk and compliance, internal controls. There's a place where cybersecurity plays into enterprise and operational risk. Continuity and resilience should be on the team. Of course, particularly in highly regulated industries, but cybersecurity is such a landmine of legal issues these days that I think you should have legal on that, since cybersecurity is more than just technology and really involves humans. Getting HR involved is really important to make sure that cybersecurity responsibilities are clearly communicated to employees. But who needs to be part of this cybersecurity maturity journey and as well, and who's on this overall team? But then what's absolutely critical is making sure you have the right tools to achieve your cybersecurity journey. Climbing a mountain, preparing for an expedition, we just don't throw everything to a bag and just start up the mountain. No, we need to carefully select our tools, like our host SimpleRisk, that can help us improve and achieve that maturity. There's a lot of solutions available in the market. You need to make sure that you have the ones that can help you really assess, measure, and monitor your journey and get you safely to what you're trying to achieve. What fails is when you start the journey with the wrong technology foundation and find out that you can't achieve what you're trying to get to, and you have to go back down and restart with new equipment. That's a failed project. But then the thing that's definitely evident in this world is you got to embrace change. There's always going to be things that come up. Our journey's never over. We might hit that nirvana of level 5. Maybe you've done that. I don't know anybody that actually thinks that they have. I think that I've encountered organizations say they were a 4.5 before, but never a 5. But something's going to come up, and the world's going to change. There could be a big merger and acquisition, and you've got to integrate all these things. A new regulation, some huge risk event happened. You got to there's new technology threat or vulnerability exposure, and something's going to happen that you have to adapt to. That's going to set you back, or have you reconsider your cybersecurity maturity in some way. So you need to be ready for change because it's going to happen. It's the inevitable. And so increasing our cybersecurity maturity should deliver value. Leveraging technology should make things more efficient, like time saved, money saved. Increasing our cybersecurity journey should make you more effective, which is itself a risk reduction. Before, our risk exposure was this. If we get to this level of cybersecurity maturity, here's our expected reduced risk exposure, and you could quantify that. It should make us more resilient to find issues and contain them when they're still small issues before they become big issues. And should help us navigate a very chaotic environment with agility, and to keep our cybersecurity program current in the midst of constant change.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it. And as always, your insight is awesome into all this stuff. I'm curious, you kind of said that you've seen organizations that are a 4.5. You said that nobody's at a 5. Where do you think the average is? And do you have a gut in terms of where do you feel people should be with all this?
I mean, I do encounter people that say they're a 1, that they're that immature, but most people are at that 2, 2.5, 3 level, and getting to a solid 3 or 4, or even a 4.5 is what they're aiming for.
Awesome.
Hey, a couple questions here. So how can you build a business case around establishing a security maturity modeling process? How do you go about that?
From my perspective, the way I approach it is around those 4 angles of efficiency, effectiveness, resilience, and agility. Today, our cybersecurity program, the current state, what's the mess that it is? So to me, it's often like Dante's Inferno, with a lot of redundancy, fractured processes. I've talked to organizations that said that we're spending 200 hours to build a risk report to the board of directors to find out we had risk issues that started 11 months ago that were out of control. That's not managing risk. That's reacting to cybersecurity risk. I was talking to a mid-sized bank that said that they did an internal study that 80% of their security and risk resources, internal control resources, 80% of their staff time is actually spent managing documents, spreadsheets, and emails, and not managing risk and cybersecurity risk. So, what's your current state? And then what's your desired future state? And what's the value to get there? And part of that business case is what's the efficiency difference? We can take that 80% of time spent managing documents, spreadsheets, and emails and actually use it to actually manage risk. What's the effectiveness? What's our reduction in risk exposure because of this? How does this enable us to find issues and contain them when they're still small before they become something that significantly harms the organization? And how does this program help us keep us up with a very dynamic business environment?
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk to a lot of people out there who are using Excel spreadsheets and things like that, kind of as a initial dip their foot into water to manage risk and controls and things like that. And I'm kind of curious, of the organizations that you talk to. I know you talk to, hundreds of organizations, probably thousands of organizations in a given year. Do you see those using GRC tools, things like that, versus those that are kind of trying to roll it their own with the Excel spreadsheets? Do you see a huge difference in terms of maturity between those different organizations?
Definitely. But I mean, a tool doesn't solve everything. I mean, technology is an important enabler, and I don't think you can achieve a high level maturity without good technology to do this. But technology, you just don't go out and buy technology and think it's going to automatically mature you. You need mature processes, you need a mature strategy, and a mature culture and engagement as well. I mean, cybersecurity can only happen if you have a strong culture of cybersecurity. You know, buying a solution is a good thing, but it doesn't achieve it by itself.
It's a really good point. And when I first started doing this exercise at National Instruments, I had to sit down with both the management teams as well as the individual contributors and kind of explain to each of them what their role in risk management was, how they were contributing to this. And with respect to management, it was, hey, you don't have visibility into these issues today. These are the skeletons in your closet. They're the bad things that could bite you in the butt, but you have no visibility. So wouldn't it be nice if we gave you that visibility, if you were able to make informed risk-based decisions on these things, as opposed to them just, might happen someday? And then when talking with the individual contributors, it was more around almost that CYOA, right? How do you, if this thing happens today, it's your butt that's on the line, you're going to get blamed for this issue. How do we move that to the people who actually do have the money and the people to be able to influence these decisions?
So I got a question. How did management react when you sat down and spoke with them about getting them involved in the process? What was their take?
That's a great question. So at least for me, it was, I think management, anytime you introduce something new, there's going to be hesitation. There's going to be people who are hesitant to actually to do these things that you're talking about. But I think that, well, I'm a big fan of Dale Carnegie, right? How to Win Friends Who Influence People. And one of the things that Dale talks about in that book is how do we frame things that we need in a way that other people are able to view those as things they need too, right? And so anytime we start going down this path of trying to explain something new, something different, we need to keep in mind how this benefits them as opposed to how it benefits us. And I'll give you an example. It's not a management example. It's actually the other side, the individual contributor side. I was speaking with a member of the Unix team, and he said, Josh, I feel like I'm at the doctor with my pants around my ankles here. He's like, I'm giving you all this risk information. What are you going to do for me? And my response was, look, these things right now, these are real issues. And if they happen, people are going to be pointing their fingers at you. So my promise to you is if we start down this path, if we make sure that we're doing risk management, we're actually handling these things in an appropriate way, my promise to you is that management is going to see these issues and they're going to make a decision in terms of what we're going to do about these issues. These are no longer your issues. They're no longer the things on your plate. You might be responsible for fixing them. But if that happens, management is the one making those decisions, which means they're also the ones authorizing you to spend time and money to fix these things.
Yeah, that ties in with what Michael was talking about when he said building kind of a security culture within your organization. So that's great feedback. Michael, any further comments on how to go about building that culture?
I mean, the most important firewall to me is the human firewall. It's not the network firewall is important to keep the hackers, viruses, and worms at bay from the network ingress and egress points, but the most important firewall is that human firewall, and that's the culture we need to nourish and develop. At all levels, from the senior level, board level engagement down into the end employee out there, the teller at the bank, the insurance agent out there in the field, the doctor or nurse at a hospital. They all need to be aware of cybersecurity within the context of their role. And sometimes we have to explain things. I was talking to one large global organization recently. It has 50,000 employees. And they started to do bow tie risk assessments on everything, including IT risk, cyber risk. And they found that the visual of like a bow tie, the board, the executives, operational management, they got it. Where before you try to explain cybersecurity, went like right over their heads. But as soon as you laid everything out and the bow tie pattern, it's like light bulbs went on. And so sometimes it's like, how can we visually communicate and engage the right brain on cyber risk that can engage people that don't understand cyber risk.
So performing internal risk assessments is a good way to get there. Any other thoughts on that and how to create a security culture?
I think I covered the previous points.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Michael, about the human firewall aspect there too. One of the things that I thought was really interesting while I was doing the security thing at NI, I was working with other teams. I was working with lots of other groups within the organization, not just within IT, but you talked about HR, we had legal, we had trade compliance. I was working with R&D. And these people would kind of come to me who weren't security people, but they had interest. They had maybe some base level of knowledge. And it became clear to me that there were, I guess the common term is champions. There were other people out there who had the right mindset, maybe not necessarily the education, but things can be taught. I can easily sit people down in a room and teach them, the policy side of things, teach them how to do things securely. And what I very quickly realized is I need to embrace those champions. I need to get them on my side. I need to communicate information to them, and then they would help me to disseminate that information to the other people in their organization, making sure that everybody knew that same kind of information and we were all acting in a secure way. So, 100% agree that people firewall is important, and embracing those champions so that you're able to get the most out of that was crucial for me and my success.
Well, I don't see any more questions here today. So I think we can wrap up, and just I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar, and we trust you found the content useful. And in addition to sending you a link to the recording and the slide deck, will be attached as a slide deck, you will also receive a short survey, and we'd appreciate it if you could take just a moment and provide your input. So thanks again for attending. We know you guys are busy, so we appreciate it, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.